Statehood, 1900 to 1940. By the end of the 19th century, Arizona had transitioned from a rough frontier into a territory with sufficient population and economic activity to warrant entry as a state. The non-Indian population in 1870 was just under 10,000. In 1880, just over 40,000. By 1890, just over 88,000. 1900, almost 123,000. And in 1910, just 2 years before statehood, 204,000 people. The dramatic increases occurred in the 1870s and the 1880s because of the discovery of gold, silver, and most importantly, copper, but also because Native Americans had been removed to the reservations, so Anglo-American families started to arrive in larger numbers. In the 1880s and 1890s, the completion of railroad lines made it much easier for people to move into the territory. By the 1890s, all territories except for Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona had entered the Union as states. Residents of Arizona began to clamor for statehood because it would allow them more self-determination in government. In a territory, the governor and top executive officers are picked by the President of the United States, and territories do not have representation in Congress. Many members of Congress in the 1890s believed that the three remaining territories, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona, had just too many quote-unquote foreign members in their population. And by that they meant Native Americans, Mexicans, and Mormons, and that therefore they were not worthy of admission. Opposition to statehood was led by Albert J. Beveridge of Indiana. He was the Republican chair of the Committee on Territories in the United States Senate. After reading reports prepared by the Department of the Interior, Beveridge stated that, quote, "The great American desert was inhabited by culturally incompatible Spanish-speaking residents and dominated by a few large absentee-controlled mining corporations and the big railroads," end quote. A two-week trip to the Southwest in 1902 by members of the Committee on Territories confirmed that view. Beveridge complained that courts required the use of Spanish interpreters to conduct business, and many of the saloons operated 24 hours a day. He also felt the territory was just a mining camp, with a population insufficiently educated and morally inferior to demand admission as full citizens. Government corruption was rampant, and Arizona was not equal in intellect, resources, or population to the other states in the Union, according to Beveridge. Arizonans had been trying to rectify this negative image of the territory for years. In 1885, the territorial legislature provided funding for institutions of higher learning. That year, bills passed that established both Tempe Normal School, the forerunner of Arizona State University, and the University of Arizona. In 1886, Tempe Normal became the first institution of higher learning in Arizona when it opened its doors with 33 students, 20 women and 13 men, 2-year degrees in education. The citizens of Tempe had raised $500 to buy 5 acres of cow pasture for the school, hoping it would attract, quote, more cultured people because it lacked the drinking and gambling elements so prevalent in early Western towns, end quote. Tuition was free to all those planning a career in teaching, and room and board in nearby homes ran about $20 a month, a far cry from today's prices to attend the university. Approximately 2% of the student body between 1886 and 1936 was Hispanic, and the first African American student was admitted in 1916. The University of Arizona, a land-grant college, took a little longer to open its doors because landowners were reluctant to donate property for the project. The university finally opened in 1891 with 32 students, and then in 1889, Northern Arizona University, originally called Northern Arizona State Teachers College, opened. Now Arizona could provide well-trained teachers for its burgeoning population, and soon would provide doctors, lawyers, and businessmen as well. Social reform movements also appeared in the territory to improve Arizona's image. Anglo women banded together in women's clubs to clean up towns. They fought against alcoholism, prostitution, and gambling. They often raised the funds to build reading rooms, which later became the city libraries. And they encouraged schools to add kindergarten classes for the youngest students and to provide school nurses to assure the health of children. In 1884, the Women's Christian Temperance Union organized its first club in the territory in Prescott, and soon there were other clubs throughout the territory. This was a national organization founded in the 1870s and led by Frances Willard, the president of Evanston College in Illinois. Members believed that women were society's housekeepers who could only protect themselves, their children, and their homes from abusive alcoholic men by eliminating liquor consumption. They sought to help women drawn to prostitution because of poverty and addiction, and they offered them education and safe housing. But while the Women's Christian Temperance Union urged its members to pledge to give up alcohol, it also had a wider focus of improving communities. They urged education for women and worked with other women's organizations to raise money to build the earliest libraries and parks in town. They often found it difficult to make headway with the local city councils or legislature when trying to pass laws to close the saloons on Sundays or to close down red light districts. Women were only allowed to vote in school board elections in Arizona, and so they had very little influence over politicians. Josephine Brawley Hughes of Tucson was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1890, and she believed that, quote, women could not wage effective battles for reform without political recourse, end quote. And so in 1891, she found the first suffrage association in Arizona, demanding for women the right to vote in all elections. Hughes was the wife of politician Lewis Hughes, and she was a partner in his newspaper in Tucson. She was also one of the earliest Anglo school teachers in Tucson, and raised the funds to build town's first Protestant church. Together, Josephine and Lewis used their Tucson daily newspaper to demand outlawing liquor and gambling, as well as advocating for women's suffrage. They argued that allowing white women to vote would improve the, quote, intelligent, unquote, vote in Arizona, and would help improve its image as a backwater in the minds of Eastern congressmen. Most of Arizona's early suffrage leaders were teachers who had worked outside the home and understood how disadvantaged women were without the vote to protect themselves. Young women were attracted to teaching in the West because they often paid more than teaching jobs back east. Women made far less than men in the same teaching positions because people believed men needed a higher salary than women because they supported a family and women did not. But in the West, where there was a shortage of teachers, school districts often paid higher salaries to attract women. And while women still received less pay than men, the pay gap was smaller. Despite the good pay, there were many challenges teaching in Arizona, especially in the early rural schools. Frances Munns, who would later become an important suffrage leader, recalled her early teaching career in Payson in the late 1880s. Because at that time this was such a small rural village, there was no rooming house, and she had to live with the family of one of her students. And they all lived together, all 6 of them, in a one-room log cabin equipped with one kerosene lamp. Of course, there was no running water and no electricity, and only an outhouse. She had a small private space curtained off where her bed stood, some hooks for her clothes, a wash basin, and a cracked mirror. The snoring of the father and the crying of the baby each night kept her up, and the children were curious about her toothbrush. They wanted to try and use it. They had never seen one before, and that was not something that she appreciated. After her teaching assignment in Payson, she quickly moved to the rough-and-tumble mining town of Jerome in 1889. There, her classroom was located in a former saloon, which was wedged between two active saloons. Drunks used to wander into her classroom, and unruly students occasionally got into knife fights. Teachers in rural areas often worked in one-room schoolhouses with numerous children from different grades. Rebecca Dallas, an African-American teacher at the Southside Colored School in Casa Grande, began her career in 1939, teaching 70 students ranging from grades 1 through 8, all in one classroom. She had older students tutor the younger students, and often needed a switch to make sure students stayed in line. African-American teachers earned about 1/3 less than Anglo teachers, and they struggled with even fewer supplies and books than their white counterparts. Arizona was one of the few places outside the South that had segregated schools. In 1909, the legislature permitted local municipalities to segregate schools based on race in the public school system. This was not a statewide mandate, but a local option that school districts had. Hispanics had been segregated in many, but not all school districts already, and now in 1909, African Americans who lived primarily in urban areas like Phoenix or Bisbee and other mining towns were often segregated as well. But with the large increases in Anglo population, their influence waned. In the mining camps, Mexican Americans were barred from working underground in the most dangerous and well-paying jobs. Many mining towns like Prescott, Wickenburg, or Bisbee became white men's camps, where local ordinances were passed to prevent Chinese or Mexicans from working or living there. Mining camps like Clifton and Morenci, however, hired primarily Mexican workers at lower wages. According to historian Tom Sheridan, quote, "What was happening was brutally clear. Arizona was creating an economic pecking order organized largely along ethnic lines. At the top were the owners and managers of the railroads, copper mines, and land and cattle companies, all of whom were Anglo-Americans or Northern Europeans. In the middle were the businessmen, ranchers, farmers, mostly Anglo, but also a few prominent Mexicans. At the bottom were people who had only their own labor to sell. Anglos dominated most skilled labor positions in the mines and on the railroads. Mexicans laid track, ran cattle, picked cotton, and hauled ore." End quote. And Chinese laborers were on the lowest rung of the ladder. The Spanish-language newspaper El Fronterizo, along with Tucson's Arizona Weekly Star, declared Chinese workers, quote, "an ignorant, filthy, leprous horde, and a fungus that lives in isolation, sucking the sap of the other plants." End quote. The Chinese were driven out of jobs in the mines or with the railroads in the early 1880s, and they were forced to open small businesses as farmers or running grocery stores, restaurants, and laundries. Mining companies took advantage of ethnic tensions. They often hired Mexican workers at lower wages when Anglos went on strike, and vice versa. Labor unions often discriminated against Mexicans, not allowing them to join and refusing to back them in labor disputes. This divisiveness hurt the labor unions, which were growing in strength as more and more miners were hired to work at the camps in Bisbee, Douglas, Clifton, Morenci, and elsewhere. Political means of ostracizing Mexicans were also employed. In 1903, the legislature passed a law that reduced the workday for underground miners from 10 to 8 hours, so workers brought home less pay. Mexican and Italian miners in Clifton, Morenci, one of the few mining towns where they could work underground, went on strike over the 10% pay cut. Because the major labor unions in Arizona, like the Western Federation of Miners, would not support them, Mexican and Italian miners turned to the mutual aid societies to organize strikes. 2,000 men marched through the streets of Clifton, Morenci. The governor asked President Theodore Roosevelt to send in National Guard troops. Roosevelt complied. Martial law was declared, and the largest military force assembled since the completion of the Apache campaign was sent in to quell potential violence. The strike leaders were arrested, and the strike failed. The show of force by the governor was a strong statement that the mining companies were firmly in control and would not tolerate insubordination, especially from Mexican and Italian miners. In 1909, the territorial legislature passed a law that required all voters to prove they could read a section of the United States Constitution. The law was supported both by the labor unions and the Democratic Party, and many Mexicans were disenfranchised. To combat racism in the workplace and to protect injured workers, Carlos Velasco, a Tucson attorney and editor of the largest Spanish-language newspaper in Arizona, El Fronterizo, founded in 1894 the largest mutual aid society in the Southwest, Alianza Hispano-Americano. This and other mutual aid societies became the most important vehicles for Mexican Americans to exercise their clout in early Arizona and to combat the legislature as it tried to pass laws to limit their ability to work and earn a fair wage or vote in Arizona. John Lorenzo Hubbell was a prominent Mexican-American businessman and politician. His father was Anglo and his mother Mexican, and he built a trading post empire in the Four Corners region, selling Navajo goods to tourists. He bridged the gap between Navajo, Anglo, and Hispanic cultures in Arizona, becoming a voice for them as county sheriff, as a member of the territorial and state legislatures, and as leader of the Republican Party in Arizona. On the other side of the political aisle from Hubbell was Democratic politician George W.P. Hunt. Hunt was born in Missouri in 1859 and worked odd jobs after arriving in the mining town of Globe in 1881. He had a knack for salesmanship and became president of a retail store in town after a few years. And then he was elected to the territorial legislature from Gila County in 1893, the beginning of a long and successful political career. Hunt was a Democrat, and he opposed the power of the copper companies and railroads in Arizona, and stood on the side of the common laborer. He would become the most prominent figure in Arizona's fight for statehood, molding the state constitution into a progressive document that included provisions for direct democracy so that average citizens could combat the power of the large corporations. In 1910, Congress could no longer argue that Arizona could be kept out of the Union. Its population had soared over 200,000. The Roosevelt Dam was near completion, and 3 institutions of higher education were in operation. And by 1910, Arizona had become the biggest producer of copper in the U.S. Arizona was authorized by Congress to choose delegates to a convention to write the state's new constitution, and George Hunt was voted president of the convention. Morris Goldwater of Prescott was vice president, and the 2 skillful Democrats were able to wheel and deal through the convention a very progressive constitution. The document the delegates approved was actually considered fairly radical for its day. It gave voters the ability to decide important laws directly with the initiative and referendum, and allowed them to recall judges. The direct primary allowed voters, rather than politicians, to pick candidates. It also provided for protection of labor unions. They gained the 8-hour workday, workmen's compensation insurance, and other concessions. The Constitution also stated that Arizona had no rights to Indian lands and could not tax them. However, the law stated that Indians living on Arizona reservations were not legal citizens of the United States and therefore could not vote. This was changed in 1924 when Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act. Although women had come to testify before the delegates and ask for the right to vote, they were denied, as were representatives from the Women's Christian Temperance Union and Mormon Church, who asked for a ban on alcohol consumption. President Howard Taft was not pleased with Arizona's radical constitution, and he rejected it because of its inclusion of the recall of judges. The offending item was removed by Arizona, and Taft signed the document. and on February 14, 1912, Arizona became the 48th state. In Bisbee, 48 sticks of dynamite were ignited to celebrate the great occasion, and in Phoenix, a parade was held downtown and included cadets from the Phoenix Indian School, Boy Scouts, war veterans, and local firemen. Women stood on the sidelines, but they were not part of the celebration because although they had tried for several decades to get the legislature to give women the vote, they were unsuccessful. On Statehood Day, state historian Charlotte Hall spoke to students at Tempe Normal School. Although she held public office as territorial historian, she could not vote. That summer, Frances Willard Munns and Pauline O'Neill, both from Prescott, took advantage of the initiative allowed by the new state constitution and successfully collected enough signatures from registered male voters to put woman suffrage on the fall ballot. Munns and O'Neill, like Josephine Brawley Hughes before them, came to believe that women could help reform Arizona if they had the vote. They argued that women voters would eliminate much of the corruption in government, pass laws to improve schools and to protect children, as well as laws to eliminate drinking, gambling, and prostitution. The suffrage measure passed in November of 1912 with 68% of the vote, and Arizona became the 6th state to allow women to vote. The victory was celebrated in a New York City suffrage parade, which you see here. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution giving all women the right to vote would not pass until 1920. In 1914, Arizona women voted for the first time and helped pass a measure that banned the consumption of alcohol in the state. At the federal level, prohibition was passed in 1919. In 1914, women also ran for office for the first time, and 2 women went to the legislature. Frances Munns was elected to the state senate, and Rachel Berry, a Mormon woman from Apache County, was elected to the Arizona House of Representatives. A woman would serve in every session of the state legislature except for one, 1924. From that time on, over the years, they passed bills that approved schools, created child welfare boards, funded better roads, and allowed women to serve on juries. Women also had success at the local political level, where voters selected many women to serve as county officials. Voters felt it was appropriate to have women elected as county school superintendents, since most teachers were female. School superintendents, women like Elsie Tolles of Cochise County, Bessie Kidd Best of Coconino County, and Gwyneth Ham of Yuma County, spent hours driving over unpaved roads to visit their schools in remote rural areas. They had to know how to change a flat tire as well as balance a school budget. They fought for funding that would allow students to go on field trips into town so that they could view a movie, use a telephone, or eat in a restaurant for the very first time. And they fought for higher pay and better conditions for their female teachers. In 1920, Elsie Tolles of Cochise County was elected Arizona's Superintendent of Public Instruction, the first woman elected to statewide office. After 1912, voters continued to send pro-labor candidates, both male and female, to the legislature and elected pro-labor George Hunt as Arizona's first governor. So labor unions picked up some momentum in their battles against the copper companies. The legislature passed a law to protect workers' right to assembly and to picket, and they tripled the tax assessments on mines. Between 1912 and 1916, there were several important strikes that allowed the unions to make gains, improving wages for both Anglos and Mexican workers. Governor Hunt himself successfully negotiated the settlement in the 1915 Clifton-Morenci strike, which was hailed nationally as, quote, a triumph for labor of the greatest importance, demonstrating as it does that labor can win its battles for industrial democracy when the government does its duty and protects the workers, end quote. Despite their gains, labor's period of ascendancy was short-lived. When World War I broke out in Europe and America joined the war in April of 1917, it created a wave of patriotism and anti-labor sentiment that had tremendous implications for Arizona. The copper companies were not happy with labor's progress, and Walter Douglas, the president of Phelps Dodge, was determined that the corporations regain the upper hand once again. The various mining companies had never worked together. They were individual corporations based in geographically diverse towns in Arizona and headquartered around the world. They had different management philosophies towards the union. Some were more sympathetic than others. But with the tax increases and gains by labor, they worked together to make sure pro-corporation men were elected to the legislature, and they purchased many local newspapers or used bribes to owners to print pro-corporation editorials. In 1915, Phelps Dodge controlled 5 of the state's most important newspapers. The war effort helped the copper communities. Copper was necessary for the war machine. It was used in the manufacturing of all-shell jackets, cable, and wires. Copper production rose dramatically from $400 million in 1910 to $200 million in 1917 when the United States joined the war. Profits were enormous. Phelps Dodge made over $24 million in 1916, and workers believed they were entitled to a share of the profits. Union membership soared not only in Arizona, but throughout the nation, and 20 strikes erupted in 1917 in Arizona alone. Although most strikes were led by the International Union of Mine, Miller, and Smelter Workers, the Western Federation of Miners with the new name, the corporations claimed they were controlled by the more violent industrial workers of the world, commonly called the Wobblies. The IWW advocated overthrowing capitalism in favor of socialism, and often advocated violence to accomplish their goal, even though they rarely employed it. During World War I, strikes and advocating overthrowing capitalism seemed unpatriotic to many Americans. Therefore, the Wobblies became the focus of anti-union sentiment in Arizona and the United States. In July of 1917, the International Mine Workers Union had shut down the mines at Globe, Morenci, and Bisbee. Phelps Dodge President Walter Douglas told workers in Globe in a speech, "There will be no compromise because you cannot compromise with the rattlesnake. That goes for both the International Union and the IWW. I believe the government will be able to show that there is a German influence behind the movement. It is up to the individual communities to drive these agitators out, as has been done in other communities in the past." End quote. George Hunt was sent by President Woodrow Wilson to mediate the Globe strike, but in Bisbee on July 12th, 2,000 hastily deputized officers under the orders of County Sheriff Harry Wheeler rounded up striking workers from their homes, throwing wives and children to the floor, screaming in the process, and many men were beaten and several died in a gunfight. 2,000 men were rounded up and brought to the baseball field in Warren, patrolled by a machine gun mounted on a car. Mine managers promised the prisoners they could go back to work if they ended the strike, and about 800 took this option. The rest, mostly foreign-born workers, especially from Mexico, were loaded onto boxcars and sent to a remote area of New Mexico, outside of Columbus, and left without food or water. According to historian Tom Sheridan, it was the largest mass kidnapping in American history. Only the shootout at the OK Corral has received more attention than the Bisbee deportation in Arizona history. President Wilson sent food and renowned attorney Felix Frankfurter, a future member of the United States Supreme Court, to investigate this act of vigilantism. Many of the deportees remained for months under federal care, and most never returned to Bisbee or even to Arizona. Sheriff Wheeler and Walter Douglas were indicted, along with hundreds of Bisbee residents, on charges of kidnapping and conspiracy, but there were no convictions. Public sentiment in Arizona supported the deportations. Most citizens believed that during a war, unions should not go on strike, and that too many radical elements that preached the elimination of capitalism had power in the unions. so the extreme measures they believed were justified. On the world stage, the successful communist revolution in Russia in 1919 created panic in the United States, and anti-labor sentiment grew because so many labor unions were considered un-American and socialist. Most of the gains by labor in Arizona were lost at this time, and although Democrats continued to dominate politics, it was the more conservative branch of Democrats, in conjunction with the corporation, that dominated politics in the 1920s. Although the First World War raised contentious issues about labor in Arizona, it also produced a hero that the new state was proud of. Frank Luke Jr., who grew up in Phoenix and worked summer vacations in the copper mines of Ajo, became the second-ranking flying ace of World War I. Luke shot down 14 German observation balloons and 4 aircraft over 30 hours of flight time. He died in action and was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. During and after World War I, patriotism was high, and there was a focus on 100% Americanism. Racism and discrimination against people of color continued to plague Arizona. The first blacks had arrived in Arizona in the 1860s, when Buffalo soldiers were first stationed at Fort Huachuca. They found low-paying jobs in some of the mining towns, like Bisbee and Phoenix, beginning in the 1860s, but their population remained very small. Just 150 African Americans in Phoenix in 1900, or only 2.7% of the population, and 328 in 1910. The legislature had already determined in 1909 that cities could opt to segregate blacks into separate public schools, and Phoenix took the step in 1910, forcing black students to walk way out of their way to a separate school. Jim Crow laws restricted them in public accommodations, like hotels, restaurants, and theaters, and many new neighborhoods began to adopt restrictive covenants that prohibited Mexican Americans or African Americans from moving in. Despite their small numbers, blacks formed fraternal organizations and women's clubs to combat racism in the 1910s and 1920s. When a local movie theater showed the extremely racist movie, The Birth of a Nation, Ella S. White, president of the Arizona Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, led a protest organized with local African American churches and organizations. The Phoenix City Council banned the movie. In 1922, when the Ku Klux Klan briefly terrorized blacks, Jews, Mormons, and Catholics in Phoenix, African American newspapers like the Phoenix Tribune condemned their actions. In 1927, Phoenix's only segregated high school opened, the Phoenix Union Colored High School, later known as George Washington Carver High School. Students attended from as far away as Chandler because their own towns did not provide facilities for their education. Despite inferior funding and materials, the faculty managed to provide a solid education for their students. World War I had a profound impact on the copper industry, as we have seen, but it also affected agriculture. The completion of Roosevelt Dam in 1911 meant that thousands of additional acres could be cultivated in the Salt River Valley. The demand for agriculture soared during World War I, and prices on alfalfa, wheat, barley, vegetables, cotton, milk, and other crops soared as well. Farmers planted more acres, but because the price of cotton was especially high, many switched from their previously well-diversified fields to become intensive, extra-long staple cotton growers. Long staple cotton was necessary for the manufacture of industrial fabrics and tires, and was mostly grown in Egypt, where there was a long growing season. It was not particularly well suited to the shorter seasons of the American South, but Arizona's climate was similar to Egypt's, so when it became difficult to get goods from overseas because of war embargoes, many Arizona farmers in the Salt River Valley, but also some around Yuma, took the plunge and decided to gamble in long staple cotton. At first, the returns were good, but there weren't enough workers, so laborers from Mexico were brought in large numbers for the first time across the border. Because there were so few restrictions on immigration until this time, most immigrants had crossed the border legally and were welcomed by the companies. Tire companies like Goodyear, Firestone, and Dunlap all invested in cotton farms in the valley. Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company bought thousands of acres around Litchfield Park, recruiting 2,000 male workers from Mexico. The men and their families lived in tents called Los Campos, or the camps, at Goodyear farms. The wives worked in the fields as well, and sometimes as domestic servants in the nearby Wigwam Resort or in local residences. When the war ended and foreign markets reopened, cotton prices dropped dramatically, and many farmers went bankrupt. The ripple effect was strong, and banks, merchants, and other businesses collapsed as well. The production of cotton fell dramatically, and many fields were replaced with citrus groves or returned to dairy farms or alfalfa fields. Prior to the 1920s, Arizona's economy had been dominated by copper, cattle, and tourism driven by its climate. But now cotton and citrus would be added to the mix, and the result was what is commonly called the 5 C's of Arizona. And a new precedent had also been established during World War I, recruiting workers from across the border with Mexico when cheap labor was in demand. The water reclamation projects that began with the Roosevelt Dam and fueled Arizona's agricultural growth continued throughout the 1920s. Mormon Flat Dam, completed in 1923, formed Canyon Lake. Horse Mesa Dam in 1924 created Apache Lake. Stewart Mountain Dam, built in 1928, created Saguaro Lake. In 1930, Coolidge Dam was created near Florence, but San Carlos Lake was slow to fill because so much of the upstream water already had been diverted for agriculture. When world-renowned humorist Will Rogers visited Coolidge Dam after it opened and saw the meager swamp forming behind it, he quipped, "If this was my lake, I'd mow it." It took 50 years to reach full capacity, as you see it here. These projects all created water for agriculture for the state, and in addition, generated hydroelectric power and created lakes for recreation. Water policy in the West was a complicated business, and politicians in the western states knew that much power resided in the states that controlled the flow of the mighty Colorado River, the main source of western water. The man in Arizona most associated with water policy was Carl Trumbull Hayden. Hayden was born in the Arizona Territory in 1877 and had grown up in what is now known as Tempe, but was then known as Hayden's Ferry. His father, Charles Trumbull Hayden, had come to Arizona seeking a cure for his respiratory problems and had run the ferry across the Salt River before it was dammed and operated the flour mill that still stands on Mill Avenue. The library at Arizona State University is named for Charles Hayden. His son Carl was born in the building that now houses the restaurant Monte's La Casa Vieja. Carl Hayden received his 2-year degree at Tempe Normal School in 1896 and then attended Stanford University. When his father died in 1900, Carl was forced to leave Stanford before completing his degree to help his mother run the family business. But Carl quickly realized he was more interested in democratic politics than in business, and he worked his way up, starting as a member of the Tempe Town Council in 1902 at the age of 25, and proceeding to become Maricopa County Treasurer and Sheriff before his election to the United States House of Representatives in 1912, when Arizona became a state. He served in the House until 1926, when he was elected to the United States Senate. Except for a couple of breaks for war service, he served in the Senate until his retirement in 1969. Over the years, he became an incredibly powerful spokesperson for Arizona, backing legislation to expand public lands and water projects, especially related to irrigation, hydroelectric power, and reclamation. Hayden's first project was the San Carlos Reservoir, which was already mentioned, but he is primarily remembered as the most valiant defender of Arizona's rights to Colorado River water, and often was engaged in debate with California's senior water experts, Representative Phil Swing and Senator Hiram Johnson. The Colorado River and its tributaries drain in 7 western states: Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. and the basin covers almost 250,000 square miles of the United States. How much water goes to each state is a contentious issue, with state representatives wrangling for their share in Congress and in the courts for decades. Senator Hayden challenged the construction of the Boulder Dam, today known as the Hoover Dam, because he believed that California would receive an unwarranted share of water that really should have gone to Arizona. He held up construction for years, and in 1928 he worked with fellow Arizona Senator Henry Ashurst to filibuster the dam bill. But when popular opinion in the United States began to overwhelmingly support the project, Hayden switched tactics to hold back funding. With the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, and then the Great Depression, the Hoover Dam project went forward despite protests from Senator Hayden. There was just too much demand for the water, electricity, and for the jobs it would create during the construction process. Hayden turned his energies to the construction of highways in Arizona. In the 1920s, the car was being mass-produced for the first time, and it was available to average middle-class buyers. Now roads would have to be constructed to accommodate them. As Hayden liked to point out, Arizona had, quote, two things people will drive thousands of miles to see, the Grand Canyon and the petrified forest. They can't get there without roads. In 1927, for the first time in history, more people traveled to the south rim of the Grand Canyon by car than by railroad. And in that same year, there were just over 200 miles of paved road in the state. It took until the late 1930s for a national highway system to be completed throughout northern Arizona, along what would become Route 66. Route 66 is designated by John Steinbeck the Mother Road and has been immortalized in song. In 1925, Arizona Highways magazine, financed with a subsidy from the Arizona Highway Department, was launched to publicize the better roads available for the driving public. At first, this was a simple pamphlet that described road conditions in drab detail. But over the years, readership expanded when the editor started using the stunning black and white photography of Joseph Munch and Ansel Adams. In 1938, the first full-color cover featured Oak Creek Canyon, and Arizona Highways became an important vehicle for popularizing Arizona tourism throughout the country and the world. Tourism surged as Americans took to the road, and Arizona responded with a variety of accommodations, ranging from the lowly auto lodge, the forerunner of the motel, to the construction of exclusive resorts like the San Carlos and Westward Ho hotels, which opened in downtown Phoenix in 1928, and the Arizona Biltmore in Paradise Valley in 1929. The Biltmore, designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright named Albert MacArthur, attracted movie stars, businessmen, and presidents. The Jokaki Inn, the predecessor of the Phoenician Resort, and Camelback Inn, both in Paradise Valley, and the San Marcos Hotel in Chandler soon followed. In 1934, a local advertising agency came up with a name that would draw more tourists to the Salt River Valley, the Valley of the Sun. Tucson originally lagged behind in the resort business, but Isabella Greenway opened the famed Arizona Inn in 1930 that became a signature destination for Tucson. Even before she opened the Arizona Inn, Greenway was an important figure in Arizona. She was a lifelong friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, and both women had profound interests in politics. Isabella had lived in a tent in a remote canyon of New Mexico for years, while her first husband tried to recover from tuberculosis. When he died in 1922, she married his close friend, John Greenway, who was prominent in Arizona politics, and she moved to the state. Because both of her first two husbands were war veterans, she built the Arizona Hut to honor them. This was a place where veterans could find employment, building furniture and making arts and crafts for sale. In 1928, because of her work with veterans and her close friendship with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, Isabella Greenway was appointed Democratic National Committee woman for Arizona and brought many women into the party to support Franklin Roosevelt's bid for the presidency in 1932. She ran for Congress in 1933 when Lewis Douglas resigned to become Roosevelt's budget director, and she won in a landslide victory, becoming Arizona's first female member of Congress. This was at a time when Arizona only had one representative in the House. She was reelected by an even larger margin in 1934. During her time in the House of Representatives, Greenway pushed through legislation that would establish codes for the copper industry, expanded irrigation and flood control projects, and worked to increase funding for roads and bridges in Arizona. She also worked hard to protect veterans and the indigent left without health care during the Great Depression. Arizona was still a young state in the formative years of its economy when the Great Depression struck in 1929. As global markets contracted, the price of goods produced in Arizona dropped. Copper went from 18 cents a pound to 5 cents a pound in 3 years, and most of the copper mines closed. The price of a yearling cow went from $45 to $15 a head, and cotton went from 11 cents a pound to only 4 cents a pound. Plants withered in the fields because it cost more to pick them than a farmer could get for them at market, and livestock was shot because it cost more to feed the animals than they were worth. Banks closed, jobs were lost, and for the very first time, people began leaving Arizona in greater numbers than they arrived. Because jobs were scarce, foreign-born workers were often fired and replaced with American citizens, not just in Arizona, but throughout the country. More than 500,000 Mexican citizens were deported from Arizona. Franklin Roosevelt's administration established a federal public work project to put people to work. The largest agency was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which provided work for unemployed men between the ages of 17 and 24 who were paid $30 a month, 25 of which was sent home to their families. They performed construction work around the country. There were 18 CCC camps in Arizona, most of which were on the national forests or the national parks. The men lived in bunkhouses in these remote camps and built improvements for many of Arizona's natural wonders. They constructed footpaths to the national monuments like Sunset Crater and Walnut Canyon. They built bridges over streams, planted trees, dug canals, and built roads and dams to prevent soil erosion. Occasionally they fought forest fires and they excavated archaeological sites. Nationwide, 3 million men worked at CCC camps. Between 1933 and 1939, the federal government spent $44 million on CCC camps in Arizona, giving jobs to over 50,000 young men from the Southwest, including Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans. Local social services were stretched to the max during the Great Depression. Places like Friendly House in Phoenix, which was established in 1922 as a place for Mexican Americans to look for employment and locate social services, continued to help people. Beginning in the early 1930s, the federal government stepped in to help agencies like Friendly House with funds from the Works Progress Administration to create recreational facilities for Mexican American children and families in the Grant Park barrio of South Phoenix. Placida Garcia Smith directed Friendly House from 1931 until the 1960s, helping new arrivals to speak English and to become citizens while also retaining their native customs. Jane Ryder was an engineer, and she was one of the first women to run a state lab. She ran the Arizona State Laboratory from 1918 to 1935, and then she became head of the Women's Division of the Works Progress Administration in Arizona. There, it was her job to find work for women. Like other states, women with few skills were put to work in sewing rooms, refurbishing and recycling clothes. Men had the CCC and the shovel, but women only had the needle and a sewing room. It is estimated that during the Depression, Arizona received around $342 million in federal assistance, while paying only $16 million in federal taxes. Federal funds helped the state's universities expand, financing the construction for buildings on the University of Arizona and the Arizona State Teachers College, as well as the Phoenix College campuses. The construction of the Hoover Dam gave employment to almost 5,000 workers in the Southwest. Construction projects worth millions of dollars were underwritten by the Federal Housing Act of 1934, giving a start to what would become Arizona's leading industry, real estate. Contractors like Del Webb built hospitals, schools, post offices, and housing subdivisions. And a local industry also blossomed, evaporative cooling. Arizona's summers have always vexed its inhabitants. The traditional solution was to leave the hot desert regions in summer for cooler climates in the mountains or on the California coast. For those who could not leave, electric fans were blown through wet sheets or blocks of ice to cool off interiors, and sleeping porches were built so people could sleep outside where the air was cooler. Reportedly, Oscar Palmer built the very first evaporative cooler in Phoenix in 1908, building a box with a fan blowing over wet burlap. However, fans were a high-priced commodity until the 1930s, so the invention did not catch on until then. But by 1933, thousands of homemade evaporative coolers appeared in the state. Unfortunately, these early homemade models were leaky, and they bred mold, and the smell gave rise to the term swamp cooler. Despite its drawbacks, the evaporative cooler afforded a higher degree of comfort for desert dwellers. The federal government got in the act, providing thousands of units for workers on the dam sites throughout the West. By 1937, most new construction projects included ductwork for the evaporative cooler, and Arizona's image as a vast inferno was starting to change. Another important development in the 1930s would also help to change Arizona's image to the outside world. Movies were all the rage during the Great Depression, and some of the greatest westerns were filmed in Arizona. When construction crews finished the work on the Parker Dam in 1938, they went to work on Old Tucson Studios, the world-renowned movie set located in the mountains west of Tucson. The movie Arizona, starring William Holden and Jean Arthur, was filmed there in 1940. More recently, the studio was home to productions for Three Amigos, Tombstone, and Wild West, among many other movies. And the immortal director John Ford filmed his classic Stagecoach in Monument Valley in 1939. The film starred a young John Wayne in his breakthrough role and won 2 Academy Awards and grossed over $1 million. Other classics like The Searcher, also starring Wayne, and My Darling Clementine with Henry Fonda followed, making Monument Valley one of the best recognized landscapes of the West. The federal government's attempt to help Native people in Arizona in the 1930s met with mixed results. In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, often called the Indian New Deal. John Collier, appointed Commissioner of Indian Affairs by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, was the force behind the federal government's new view of tribal communities. Collier believed the Dawes Severalty Act had destroyed the communal activities and culture of Native Americans, and he wanted to restore Native pride and self-determination. Tribes created their own councils and tribal constitutions for governance, with mixed results. The notion of tribal identity was foreign to most groups, who were fractionalized into clans rather than united as a united Hopi, Apache, or Navajo nation. It was a slow process for most tribes to embrace and exercise government based on an Anglo model. The Navajo faced a special crisis during the 1930s. They had always been sheep and goat herders, and their animals were their prized possessions, providing the wool for rugs and blankets, becoming the most traded commodity in the community, as well as the cornerstone of their religious practices. Kit Carson had reduced the number of sheep with Navajo had been removed to Bosque Redondo. but over the years the federal government had replaced much of the herd, and under the skilled care of the DNA, they had multiplied to 1 million head in the 1930s. Unfortunately, the sheep and goats were beginning to overgraze the fragile Navajo land. Federal officials during the Great Depression were concerned with soil erosion, which had such disastrous implication for the Dust Bowl farmers. Collier argued that the herd had to be reduced to preserve the land. But the animals meant so much to the Navajo that this was a calamitous decision, analogous to the long walk they endured to Bosque Redondo 7 decades before. The Navajo watched helplessly as the federal government killed thousands of animals that they could no longer afford to feed. Some resisted, hiding their animals and intimidating officials. One positive did result. Because of the federal government's offensive stock reduction policy, Navajos, who had long been detached and uninterested in the white man's ways, now sought to educate themselves and engage in the larger world. As World War II broke out, they found useful roles outside of the reservation, all the while focusing on ways to preserve their traditional culture. Here are 2 questions for further consideration. Briefly describe what living in Arizona was like in the early 20th century. What was it like to be a miner? What was it like to teach school? Also, what was Arizona's response to the Great Depression? What jobs were available to men and women?